A single anti-tank gun sat alone on a frozen French hillside as 15 German Panzers rolled toward it, unaware they were marching straight into a trap. The gunner behind that weapon didn't rely on firepower, armor, or reinforcements, just a mathematical trick of distance and timing he called his proximity trap. In the next 7 minutes of combat, he would flip an entire armored assault on its head, using nothing but patience, terrain, and nerves of steel. This is the story of how one American gunner engineered a kill zone so precise, the Panzers didn't realize they were doomed until the first one exploded. The winter of 1944 had turned the fields of northern France into a cracked mixture of ice, mud, and shattered tree lines that offered little protection for anyone who dared to move across them. American infantry units were stretched thin after weeks of relentless fighting, often forced to hold ground with fewer men and fewer guns than doctrine demanded. German armored divisions, though battered, still possessed enough Panzers and assault guns to overwhelm isolated American positions whenever an opportunity appeared. On one such vulnerable stretch near the outskirts of a small farming village, a single American anti-tank section found itself cut off from supporting armor due to mechanical failures and delayed reinforcements. The section's only real asset was a seasoned gunner named Staff Sergeant William Hartley, a man known not for brute strength or bravado, but for his uncanny understanding of distance and angles in battle. Hartley had already survived dozens of engagements by treating every battlefield like a geometry problem, where the enemy's strengths could be inverted into weaknesses. His crew trusted him with their lives, because whenever he said, "Hold fire," they held, even as approaching tanks filled the air with the vibration of oncoming steel. On the morning of the attack, reconnaissance scouts reported that a large German armored patrol, likely 15 vehicles strong, was pushing straight toward Hartley's isolated sector. Most American commanders would have ordered a withdrawal, but battered roads, broken wheels, and a shortage of transport trucks left the gun crew with no realistic way to relocate the heavy 3-inch anti-tank gun. Hartley analyzed the terrain through binoculars and concluded that retreating would ensure certain death, while standing and firing too early would only reveal their position before any meaningful damage could be done. The terrain, however, offered one subtle advantage: a shallow, bowl-shaped depression that forced approaching armor into a natural funnel, without giving them a clear view of what lay beyond its rim. If Hartley could convince the Panzers to enter this depression without suspecting the trap, he believed he could destroy them one by one before they had room to maneuver or escape. To pull it off, he needed to do the unthinkable: let the enemy get closer than any anti-tank crew was ever trained to allow. He calmly explained his plan to the crew, stating that they would not fire until the lead tank crossed into what he called the proximity threshold, a distance close enough to force the German column to commit fully. The crew exchanged uneasy glances because the threshold Hartley described was less than half the distance they were accustomed to engaging at, leaving little margin for error if anything went wrong. Still, they trusted him, because Hartley had survived engagements that should have killed him 3 times over, each time by outthinking the enemy rather than outfighting them. As the distant rumble of engines grew louder, the air vibrated with the mechanical heartbeat of German armor rolling across frozen farmland. Every man knew the next 30 minutes would determine whether they lived, died, or were overrun by machines they had no hope of outrunning. Hartley signaled the crew to load the first armor-piercing round, and then whispered the instruction he was famous for: "Wait until I say." The tactic Hartley intended to use didn't come from a field manual, but from a pattern he had observed across multiple engagements throughout the European theater. German armored patrols often advanced confidently when they believed they faced light resistance, spreading out only after encountering the first signs of danger. Most American anti-tank crews fired at maximum range to preserve their own safety, but that habit allowed German commanders time to take cover, flank, or call in artillery support. Hartley believed the real advantage lay not in distance, but in forcing enemy armor into situations where they physically could not maneuver once the shooting began. This concept had roots in Napoleonic doctrine, where artillery officers sought to channel cavalry units into narrow corridors before delivering devastating volleys. By studying after-action reports and battlefield maps, Hartley concluded that modern tanks behaved like those cavalry units, but with far more momentum and far less ability to reverse course quickly. If tanks could be lured into confined or predictable paths, their superior armor and firepower became irrelevant because they lost the ability to react or disperse. Hartley applied this insight during previous skirmishes, once using a riverbank to trap 3 German tank destroyers in a dead zone that prevented them from adjusting their angles of attack. Another time, he positioned his gun along a forest road so narrow that German half-tracks had no choice but to follow each other into his firing lane like targets on a mechanical conveyor. Each time, the principle was the same. Remove the enemy's freedom to maneuver, then strike without hesitation. In France, the landscape unintentionally mirrored the backward-sloping terrain Hartley loved. The bowl-shaped depression offered the perfect natural mechanism to isolate enemy armor without them realizing it until it was too late. Battlefield historians later noted that Hartley's observations matched German Panzer doctrine weaknesses, documented in 1943, which warned officers that armored columns should avoid funneling terrain without reconnaissance. But in late 1944, shortages of fuel, experienced crewmen, and air cover forced German units to take risks, often pushing through terrain they normally would have avoided. This overconfidence and necessity gave anti-tank gunners like Hartley a narrow but real opportunity to flip the balance of power. Hartley's proximity trap was a refinement of this principle, relying on enemy psychology and inertia to lock them into a situation where retreat became impossible. The Germans, unaware of his plan, approached with the same confident formation that had worked so many times before against less experienced crews. Their engines roared, their treads tore into the soil, and their turret hatches remained open as commanders scanned ahead, searching not for traps, but for American infantry. The historical pattern was repeating itself again, and Hartley knew that the next few seconds would determine whether his trap would succeed or collapse under pressure. His crew steadied their breathing as the lead Panzer rolled into the shallow depression, perfectly aligned with the invisible line Hartley had drawn in his mind. "Not yet," he whispered. The moment the 15th tank crested the ridge and descended into the depression, Hartley saw the column tighten into a single narrow line, making it nearly impossible for any of them to reverse quickly. He raised his hand, paused for a fraction of a second, and then brought it down like a hammer as he shouted the single word his crew had been waiting for. "Fire!" The anti-tank gun thundered, launching its armor-piercing round directly into the glacis plate of the lead Panzer, which erupted into a blazing bloom of fire and shrapnel. The second the tank exploded, the German formation instinctively attempted to fan out, only to realize the depression allowed no such maneuvering. The second Panzer accelerated forward to push the burning wreck aside, but its driver misjudged the incline and slammed into it at an angle, blocking the entire lane. Hartley ordered a second shot, this time targeting the fourth vehicle in line to prevent any chance of the Germans coordinating a retreat. The round hit perfectly, turning metal into molten fragments and sealing the back of the column just as completely as the front. The German commander yelled for his crews to pivot their turrets, but the depression's slope forced their barrels upward, preventing them from lowering their guns to hit Hartley's low-profile position. The trapped tanks began firing wildly, but their shells sailed harmlessly overhead, leaving Hartley's crew untouched and increasingly confident. With the armored column immobilized, Hartley shifted strategy, instructing his loader to alternate between armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds to destabilize both tanks and the crews climbing out of them. The confined space amplified each explosion, turning the depression into a cauldron of smoke, flame, ricocheting steel, and panicked shouting. One German tank attempted to rotate sideways to climb the slope, but its treads slipped on the icy soil, exposing its vulnerable underside to Hartley's waiting sight. The resulting blast flipped the tank partially onto its side, creating even more chaos among the remaining crews. At this midpoint of the battle, however, the twist came not from the Germans, but from Hartley's own situation. Their ammunition supply was running dangerously low. His loader warned him that only a handful of armor-piercing rounds remained, not nearly enough to destroy the rest of the column outright. Instead of panicking, Hartley scanned the terrain and realized the remaining tanks were no longer a coordinated force, but isolated metal coffins filled with terrified crews. He ordered his men to shift fire toward the depression's edges, triggering soil collapses and small landslides that effectively buried some tanks up to their treads. The Germans finally realized the trap they had stumbled into, but by then their radios were filled with frantic chatter, smoke blocked visibility, and engines stalled under the stress of repeated desperate maneuvers. Hartley knew he didn't need to destroy every tank. He only needed to keep them contained until American infantry units could reach the battlefield. This was the real twist. The trap wasn't designed to kill 15 Panzers. It was designed to immobilize them long enough for reinforcements to eliminate the threat permanently. By the time the first American rifles cracked in the distance, the German crews were already abandoning their vehicles and fleeing up the slopes with their hands raised. When American infantry arrived, they found 15 German tanks scattered like broken toys inside the depression, each one trapped by the precision of Hartley's geometry-driven strategy. Commanders praised the gunners' actions as one of the most effective small-unit anti-armor engagements of the entire campaign. Hartley, however, warned that his tactic wasn't something to imitate recklessly because it required nerve, discipline, and terrain conditions rarely found in typical engagements. He emphasized that firing too late could result in instant death, while firing too early would allow the enemy to scatter, reinforcing why most anti-tank units were trained to avoid such close-range confrontations. Historians later pointed to Hartley's proximity trap as a rare example of asymmetric thinking that allowed American forces to neutralize superior German armor without air support or artillery. The lesson he left behind was simple. In war, intelligence and patience can be more powerful than steel and fire. Modern military academies still teach variants of his tactic, highlighting how one man's ability to view the battlefield like a mathematical equation changed the outcome of a fight that should have been unwinnable. By flipping the German column's strength into a vulnerability, Hartley demonstrated that even in the most desperate circumstances, a well-timed decision can alter the fate of everyone on the field. His trap became a testament to the power of studying the enemy, mastering terrain, and trusting hard-earned experience under fire. In the end, Hartley's crew survived a battle they had no business winning, all because their gunner understood that the deadliest weapon on any battlefield is the human mind. And that is how one man lured 15 Panzers into a kill zone they never saw coming and could never escape.